All right, my name is Heather Gray, and the program is Just Peace, and I want to welcome you all to our program this evening. I'm pleased to tell you we are going to be talking with Alan Wieder this evening, who has just come out with a book about Studs Terkel. I'm looking forward to having this discussion with him about Studs Terkel. Before I go any further, though, I want you to know that the opinions expressed on Just Peace do not necessarily represent those of Radio Free Georgia Broadcasting Foundation, Incorporated, its staff, or volunteers. Alan, are you there? Let me check that first.
I am, Heather. Good to talk to you again.
Well, it's wonderful to have you on the air here at WRFG yet again. So I just want to give a little bit of an intro to Alan. He is, as I mentioned, he's just come out with a book about Studs Terkel. It's entitled Studs Terkel, Politics, Culture, but Mostly Conversation. Alan Wieder is an oral historian and author. He is author of several books on race and education, especially in apartheid South Africa, including Teacher and Comrade, Richard Dudley and the Fight for Democracy in South Africa, Voices from Cape Town Classrooms, Oral Histories of Teachers Who Fought Against Apartheid, and one of his latest books that I've talked with you about before on Just Peace is Ruth First and Joe Slovo in the War Against Apartheid. Alan, that was an amazing book, published in 2013. But you have now come out with this book about Studs Terkel, and I'm going to repeat the name of the book again. Studs Terkel, Politics, Culture, but Mostly Conversation. I want all of you all to also know that Alan Wieder is going to be here in Atlanta next week, thanks to Acapella Books, and he will be speaking at the Carter Presidential Library, and we'll provide more information about that as well. So, Alan, welcome.
Thanks again. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to come to Atlanta.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to having you here. So, now, Studs Terkel, why did you want to do this book about Studs Terkel? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a long story that I'll try to make short. So I was a doctoral student in the late 70s, and I wanted to do oral history as a dissertation, and at the time, it wasn't seen as proper research in the academy. I mean, there were people that did it, but it didn't get much respect. And Studs had started to write. He didn't write any of his oral histories till he was 57 years old, but he had come out with a number of them. And I was lucky. I had a committee. I studied with people who respected and really liked his work. So I had him as a foundation, and so I think I owe him a lot. There's a debt to be paid that I was able to do the work that I did for many years as an academic and now outside of academia because of the foundation that he laid for me. The other part, of course, was that I think that my politics were akin to his politics. He was very involved from his youth in progressive politics. He was a third-party guy his entire life, and he spoke back to power, and for 45 years, he had a big venue to do it. I might say also, this obviously didn't happen to me, but he was blacklisted. So here's a guy that politically, as well as a radio guy and an author, had his hand in so many things and tried to change the world in a good way.
So there's a lot there. So where do we begin with this? But you're saying that he laid the groundwork for you. Why is that? Well, I guess it's partly to do with you being an oral historian, right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that he gave credibility to a field. I mean, it's kind of interesting that there was an oral history association that got started at around the same time that Studs started coming out with his books, and they had a kind of an interesting relationship with Studs. So on the one hand, there was some tension because he wasn't an academic, but on the other hand, they knew that he popularized oral history and he gave it voice in America. And one way to think about that is really quickly is a number of his books. He wrote the book Working, that was a major book of people talking about their lives and their work and the struggles within it. He wrote a book on the Depression. His book that won a major prize, the Pulitzer Prize, was called The Good War, and I should say it had quotations around it because his wife Ida, who he always liked to say was way more radical than he was, insisted on it. I mean, her line was, "There's no such thing as a good war. You have to have quotations around that." It was about World War II. So I think we could go many ways, but for for your show and the things that you do both on your show and in your life, it might be good to talk about his politics that had to do with both class and race throughout his life.
Okay, so one of the things you said is that one of the things that you both had were similarly inclined is toward third parties. So what do you explain that? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, Studs, when he was a young boy, used to listen with his dad to Eugene Debs' speeches on radio, and his dad loved Debs, and he was raised in a hotel that his parents ran, a men's hotel, and he would listen in the lobby every day and every night to the people debate. And there were IWW people, Wobblies, and there were people that hated the Wobblies. There were religious fanatics, and there were atheists, and that extended to him going to a place called Bughouse Square in Chicago, in downtown Chicago, where there were political speeches as well as other kinds of speeches, and he was, again, taken by the Wobblies. At the same time, he was introduced to issues of race in his late teens and his early 20s also, and that became a lifelong passion for him of both fighting and documenting white supremacy in the United States, and not just the United States. Another link that I have with Studs, which I think is really interesting, is that in 1963 he did an amazing documentation of people within apartheid South Africa.
Yes, because that obviously has been quite an interest of yours as well. So, but even before we go to South Africa, Alan, let's just talk a little bit about Studs and his work. Now, he was a radio producer in Chicago, right?
Yeah, well, he started off, he actually went to law school and never practiced law for a day in his life. And he was involved in the 1930s in the Chicago Repertory Theater, which was a very political theater group. They did perform in traditional theaters, but they also performed in union halls. The first play that he was in was Clifford Odets' Waiting for Lefty, and then he was part of the Illinois Writers Project during the Depression, which was a Roosevelt thing, and he was in that with Richard Wright, and he was in that with Nelson Algren, and again, very, very progressive politically, which leads to and at the same time, he had roles on radio soap operas. He always played the gangster that got killed. He used to tease about it that I never made it through 3 editions of any show because I was always killed off. And a disc jockey, and then because of that, and this ties to politics in his work, he got a TV show in Chicago. It was called the Chicago School of Television, and there were 3 main shows. One was Dave Garroway at Large, that became the Today Show when it moved to New York. And then secondly, there was Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, which everybody knows about with the puppets, and that also moved to New York. And Studs' show was called Studs Place, and it was kind of a old-time Cheers. It was in a diner, and there was a cast that was always on, and they took on issues. They were the first TV show to ever have a pregnant woman. I've read, and because he was involved politically, and his line was, "I never met a petition that I didn't sign," he was blacklisted, and so the other 2 shows moved to New York. He wouldn't sign a loyalty.
So who blacklisted him?
Well, he was never called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but he lost his show. NBC canceled his show because he refused to sign a loyalty oath, and he had no work. His wife was a social worker, and for 3 or 4 years he wasn't able to work in Chicago. Nobody would hire him, and then he did finally get a job in 1952, and that's getting to the question. Yes, and he became he had a radio show for 45 years on the same station in Chicago, WFMT. And he didn't start doing interviews, but he moved into doing interviews. In this show, he interviewed people from every facet of life. He interviewed theater troops from London. He interviewed opera people. He interviewed Stokely Carmichael. In 1954, he interviewed Paul Robeson, which was a really brave act at the time to have him on his show, because nobody would have Paul Robeson on their show. And he interviewed authors. He didn't interview many politicians. He found that pretty useless. He didn't think you ever got honesty. But
well, let me try to put this in some context. So he was interviewing all these great civil rights leaders, right? So was this unique at the time? What years are we talking about here? 50s, 60s?
It started in the mid 50s and went through 1997 actually.
So this was this unique, Alan?
Oh, it was unbelievably unique. I've been told that there was somebody that did similar things in Berkeley for a while, and it's funny. At the end of Studs' life, when he still wrote books, he wrote 5 books in the last 6 years of his life, and he would do interviews. He didn't travel, but he did them from the studio in Chicago with other stations, and he usually chose community stations and Pacifica stations. There were only 2 NPR people that he was willing to do interviews with, because he thought they were also great interviews. One was Leonard Lapate in New York, and the other was Mark Steiner in Baltimore. So he really was this common man feeling, and he had, I neglected to mention that a lot of his shows were of people on the streets. He interviewed teachers. He interviewed union leaders that we've never heard of, and that was the big thing, that besides people that we know, he did probably more interviews on his radio show and then in his books with people we've never heard of. Yeah, it's a big thing.
So what he was really doing was recording the American left as well as the civil rights movement, right, for freedom, right?
Yeah, and also people that opposed it, because he
talked to the Klan at one point.
He did. He said one of his well, there's two specific interviews, and one connects to the South, not to Georgia, but to North Carolina. But one of the interviews that he said he suffered the most from was interviewing a neo-Nazi who was a cab driver in Chicago, and he suffered it because he really thought that there was a decent heart in there, but here was a guy who the only credence he got, the only place he found his identity was in a neo-Nazi group. But then the counter to that point was a man named C.P. Ellis, which Studs claimed was his most important interview, because he loved transformational interviews. He loved to talk to people that had made transformations, and C.P. Ellis was the head of the Ku Klux Klan in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm not going to go through the whole story, but through a transformation, he became a civil rights leader and a political left union leader in Durham.
Wow, how interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and he found that all the time. I mean, people, besides the political, people that he interviewed, he loved to be amazed, and he also amazed people all the time. That's why when people ask me, what would he say about this election, I say, well, I can talk about it, but Studs surprised us so often, I can't be sure. But the longtime editor of The Nation, Vic Novosky, is probably a great example. He went to, he interviewed him on his radio show for his book on the Kennedys, and Novosky said it was the most amazing experience he ever had. Here, the book was all underlined in yellow. There were notes all over the front cover, the back cover, notes everywhere. And he said Studs at one point said, on page 37 you say this, and this. That's an amazing insight. Nobody's ever said that. And Novosky goes, wow, I didn't know it was that insightful. Amazing, that he would do that. Interesting. Yeah, and so there was stuff like that all the time in the books of people telling him things that they had never thought they even believed or felt.
We're going to take a quick break, Alan. We'll be back in just a second. I want you to know, also, and the listeners to know, we have Cliff Albright here in the studio. He'll be asking some questions as well. So stay tuned. We'll be back in just a moment, all right? All right, again, my name is Heather Gray, and the program is Just Peace, and I'm pleased to say we're talking with Alan Wieder about his new book coming out, or it's already out, actually, and he'll be here in Atlanta this next Monday at Acapella's bringing him in. He'll be speaking at the Carter Presidential Library, and I'm going to get some time for that, which will be at 7 p.m. on October the 10th at the library, and so it'll be a treat to have you here in the city, Alan. So just getting back to Studs, of course. So he talked with a variety of people, but he was obviously interested in social change, but he was interested in all the parties that were playing a role in that, and the role of the Klan. Okay, so here we have the Klan. So what do they think, and what do we do about that? So he was not shy about attempting to talk with anyone, it seems to me. Is that right, basically?
Yeah,
except for politicians, as you say. He didn't want to necessarily do that, but go ahead.
No, he didn't. In our age generation, he would talk to Nader and Kucinich, and that was about it. But, which is interesting, and again, stories. We could talk about Studs for 7 hours. There's so many
I'm sure.
stories, and I think that one of the things that the book actually does is it's the only place where there's a critical mass of Stud stories, and there's probably a million more that I don't have. But anyway, like you said, yeah, he would talk to anyone, and it had to do with, one of the things that he did that was so amazing to me was he, besides going to marches and lending his support to rallies about all union issues, social class, the homeless, he documented the fight against racism here in the United States and in South Africa. And in all those places, he interviewed activists as well as people on the ground, as well as, sometimes much to his heartbreak, strident racists. Right. And that happened in both, not both, it happened at home in Chicago, where he was always critical of Mayor Daley as a racist. He was critical of Mayor Daley for many things, but racism was the big thing. He, in South Africa, interviewed people that were pro-apartheid, but also interviewed the leader at the time in 1963 of the African National Congress. He, at the end of the March on Washington, he interviewed people who thought it was the best day of their lives, and other people that thought, why are they screwing up traffic, And then, but most powerfully, I think, was in Montgomery, Alabama, after the Selma Montgomery March, where he said it was the first time that there were only 2 times where he was afraid when he did interviews. One was in outside of Durban in South Africa, and the other was in Montgomery, Alabama.
Oh, wow.
The stories of those things.
Interesting. Sorry?
Yeah. No, yes.
Yeah, well, Cliff has a question. Go ahead, Cliff.
Hey, Alan. My question is, those of us who are familiar with African studies, I heard at the beginning of the interview, we were talking about how difficult it was for you when you were first coming in, and how Studs kind of laid the path in terms of oral history. What do you think it is that first got him interested in? What I was saying was that within the field of African American studies, the focus on the oral tradition and oral histories is very strong and very important. But I'm just thinking about Studs coming up in the time when he was coming up. What was the major influence that made him even see this as a methodology that was worth using, that was powerful to use?
Yeah, I think there were 2 initial things, and then a third thing. The 2 initial things were that he when he was in law school, he listed the most important things when he was in law school, and law school was number 5, and number 1 was being in what was then called Bronzeville in Chicago, the south side of Chicago, and spending an enormous amount of time in the record stores listening to jazz and blues, and then. The second influence, I think, was his relationship starting in the mid-'40s with Paul Robeson, who I already mentioned. They were together 2 of the people that worked very hard to get Henry Wallace elected, which obviously didn't happen in 1948. And he also spent some time traveling with Paul, and he emceed. They did 50th birthday celebrations in 1948 all over the United States for Paul Robeson, even though he had been, sort of banned by the United States government as a communist, and Studs stood up for him at every place and would be the MC. But he also always said that he had two teachers that taught him about his own racism. And one was the blues artist Big Bill Brunzi, who was a very close friend of Studs in Chicago. And the other was Mahalia Jackson. And in the book, I talk about two stories where he felt that he wronged them, and who was he to say that they should do something when he never felt the hurt or the pain of racism. And I think those human experiences were what connected him to his belief and Ida's belief. I mean, Ida Terkel, after Fred Hampton was murdered...
His wife, right?
His wife, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Go ahead.
Heather. So after Fred Hampton was murdered in 1969 in Chicago by the Chicago police and other state police, the Black Panthers were very worried that their offices would be destroyed. And Ida was a member of the Chicago Peace Coalition, and they took turns. These upper middle class white women took turns sitting with a card table 24 hours a day in front of the Panther headquarters, and Ida took the 4:30 a.m. shift. This is a 4'11" woman with white hair, and she was very adamant they're not going to go through us at that point.
Good
so
for her.
I've gone further than your question, but I think that lays out some of the foundation.
No, that answers it perfectly. Thanks.
Let me ask you this as well, Alan. Our mutual friend Prexy Nesbitt, who I talk with often on my show as well, actually, he was saying that Studs was instrumental, I think, in helping to integrate. Is it West Chicago, the west side of Chicago? I don't know. You would probably know that better than I would, but I was impressed with that too. I guess this was going after Mayor Daley and his policies,
yeah,
probably.
Definitely went after Mayor Daley. And also, when Prexy called him, or one of his very close friends, Timmy Black, who I was fortunate enough to have come out and talk when I was in Chicago. He's 97 years old now, and he was a civil rights activist. And anyway, he's just this wisdom in the room. And Studs did a lot of work with him. He did the same thing for the Young Lords, of helping the Young Lords in communities. So he was everywhere in Chicago like that. And the other thing about Studs and race is that by the end of his life, he was somewhat. He wasn't a huge celebrity, but he was a celebrity, and he used to make fun of himself. Like, how can you become a celebrity when your whole reputation is based on the uncelebrated? So he would make fun of himself of being a celebrity, and he got all these honors. Clinton honored him at the White House, but he said the one honor that meant something to him was in 1999, he became the only white person ever inducted into the Hall of Fame for writers of African descent.
Oh, wow.
Pretty amazing. And it had to do with Gwendolyn Brooks being close to him, and it also had to do with Haki Madhubuti, who is a Chicago. He used to be Don Lee, the poet. Now Haki is much more than a poet. But Haki, when he inducted him, said, biologically, Studs Terkel is not a black man, but psychologically and philosophically, Studs Terkel is a black man. And he went on with more, but Studs viewed that as his most important honor of his entire life. Wow.
Well, I need to say that we have so little time left in discussion with you. I want to tell the listeners that at 6:30 we're going to be talking with Dr. Julius Garvey, who is the son of Marcus Garvey. Actually, we're going to talk about some of his initiatives in attempting to get a presidential pardon for his father, Marcus Garvey. However, Alan, just tell us quickly in the next few minutes, one of the things that so intrigues me about Studs Terkel and his radio work and in his oral histories is that he was able to draw from people. I think we make assumptions. We'll see someone and we think, okay, so we can make assumptions about what their story is, but he didn't necessarily do that. He just drew so much from them, right? Which just totally intrigues me. It's important for radio folks to... Go ahead, for Go ahead.
No, I think it is, and he viewed the interviews as very different. So the one thing that stands out is respect, which is pretty clear. And he was astounded when he went to do some interviews when he had books out, and people hadn't even read the books, and he was just furious. But I think that part of that has to do with he so believed in conversation, and it wasn't conversation for the sake of conversation. And this came out of his upbringing, I think, that he believed that conversation and debate were, if you didn't have conversation and debate, you couldn't have a democracy, you couldn't be a citizen. And that's connected to that. And the other part, directly to your question, probably the best story in the book is a guy called Mark Larson, who was a Chicago teacher, raised in a liberal family, believed he could never be a racism, and then was astounded that the kids viewed him as a racist. And while Studs was interviewing him, all of a sudden he started to talk about why the kids viewed him as a racist, and he got it, and he understood it, and he talked it to Studs, and Studs was astounded. He was like, oh my God, I've never seen someone be so honest about their own flaws and fable, and they both learned from it, and Mark learned a lot from it. It wasn't his beliefs, but it was the way he was treating kids in the high school where he taught, and the assumptions that he was making that he really didn't even believe in.
Wow, how interesting!
But
so it's kind of
so deep, right?
Yeah, so it's a cleansing process in a way to be able to admit this, to get it out, so you could deal with it, I guess.
Yeah, and that's a pretty strong one, but there's other smaller ones, that, and I could never do this. I'm an artist. He used to sit right next to the person. So he was literally right next to you on a couch or on a bench, and as he talked to you.
Well, Alan, I want to thank you so much for sharing all this with us, and we're looking forward to seeing you in next week, next Monday. I'm going to that after my show here on WRFG, so I look forward to seeing you there. And again, that Alan Wieder will be having a book signing of his new book about Studs Terkel. So that's Monday, October the 10th at 7 p.m. at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. Alan, thanks so much for your great work.
Thanks, Heather. I love being on your show.
Thank you. All right, take care now. Peace. All right. So that was interesting.
Yeah, it was incredibly just, it's amazing when you think about how dedicated he was, not just to progressive issues, but to racial issues as well. And I wish we had much more time with Alan, because I'd love to find out. He talked about how Studs was impacted by his time in Chicago and listening to jazz and his interactions with Paul Ropes, but I'd love to know more about what, even as a young person, because to even get to that point of being open to have those relationships as an adult, there must have been something even in the earlier years that shaped him, that made him to be open to those types of things. So I would have loved to be able to get into those issues as well.
Absolutely.